Welcome to The Subverse. I am your host, Susan Mathews. This is a podcast where we journey from the cosmic to the quantum, from forest soundscapes to fragile oceans, from the songs of whales and trees to the secret world of microspecies and microbes, from colonial histories that haunt us to reimagining futures. My last guest for the season is Professor Banu Subramaniam, who in June 2024 published a wonderful book titled Botany of Empire: Plant Worlds and the Scientific Legacies of Colonialism. She is the Luella Professor of Women's and Gender Studies at Wellesley College, Massachusetts, and is an interdisciplinary scholar trained as an evolutionary biologist and plant scientist. In this episode, we look at how botany was shaped by colonialism and how we might undo these legacies to imagine an interdisciplinary and counter-colonial botany that is less anthropocentric and more empirically attuned to plant worlds. In this book, Professor Subramaniam focuses on three subfields: plant taxonomy, plant reproductive biology, and plant biogeography. On plant taxonomy, according to her, any systematic study of plants leads us through the thoroughly embrangled colonial worlds of plants and humans and their co-evolved histories, a topic absent from most botany classes. Colonial routes of plants included the famous spice routes and transportation of lumber resources, plantation crops, and horticultural specialties, but also a trove of other agricultural plants and animals. In the book, she writes, "The site of the herbarium, cataloguing the richness of plant diversity, vividly captures the colonial project, a global mortuary that revels in the violent necropolitics of botany." She tells us about Carl Linnaeus with his classificatory system published in 1753 as a figure looming large over botany. As a juxtaposition, we also hear of the Hortus Malabaricus, which was published between 1678 to 1693, where we see a distinct blurring of boundaries between Western and indigenous medicine and upper and lower caste knowledge and practice. She also spoke of the traditional knowledge database library started in the 1990s in India, which also brings to the forefront questions of authenticity, what is indigenous knowledge, and needing to do our best to avoid essentialist claims. In the conversation on plant sexuality and biogeography, what really shone through was biological exuberance, diversity, rethinking intimacy and play, revisiting histories of colonial plant breeding, and eschewing the botanical sublime, which lends itself to a separation of nature and culture. In discussing biogeography, the background is that ever since 1492, parts of the world have grown more alike as ecosystems have collided and intermingled. In this regard, we spoke of invasion biology and how the notions of diaspora and diaspore are more apt ways to describe the contemporary movement of plants. This book and Professor Subramaniam's work in general is a highly skillful and joyful challenge to the coloniality of science, to our botanical amnesia, and showing the imperial project to be primarily an ecological one, moving plants, animals, and humans around the world through plunder and for profit. What a book, and what a way to end the season. Hope you all enjoyed the season finale as much as I did. Banu, it's such a pleasure to have you join us. Thank you so much for joining us at the Subverse.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. So thanks for the invitation.
I want to start by saying that I absolutely loved reading your book. I'm not much of a plant person myself. Anything that I try to grow instantly dies on me. And I think I'm mostly plant and tree blind, but I thoroughly enjoyed reading a book. In fact, after reading it, I feel like I need to become a little bit more plant aware. It's really stoked an interest in me. So thank you so much for this beautiful book.
Thank you. That's, warms the heart to hear that.
So I want to start with the main question that you raise in your book. And here you talk about plant worlds and the legacies of colonialism. And so from the 15th century was ushered in a more systematic and systematized knowledge of plants, with one figure who loomed large. Carl Linnaeus, a Swedish botanist, taxonomist, and a colonial figure himself. Can you speak to us about this novel system of classification and nomenclature and what unfolded as the result?
Sure. Is it okay to give you a little prelude to how I came to that?
Yes, please.
So I'm trained as a plant biologist. And halfway through graduate school, I finished my undergraduate in India and then came for a PhD in evolutionary biology in the US. And as you may well know, in India, we start specializing very, very early. So after, 10th standard, you go the science route and then a specialization in the science, which meant that when I came for a PhD, I had never taken a course in sociology or at the undergraduate level, any of the humanities, so other than a language. And so I think I felt I had no vocabulary of culture, of understanding what was happening in graduate school. And moving across, even though we watch TV, moving across to a different country was quite a change. And I had no framework to understand that. And so that's what took me to women's studies, where someone said, this is a very common story of what people say. And so I started taking courses, trying to understand the history of women in science. And then it quickly became clear that there was something deeper happening here. And in thinking about how knowledge is produced. And so that's what led to my first book, Ghost Stories for Darwin. And where Darwin was the figure that loomed large in the history of population biology and evolutionary biology. And then, given what was happening in India, I got really interested in Hindu nationalism. And I think that is when I encountered how important colonial histories are. And so those two books together is what led to this one, The Botany of Empire, in thinking about the history of biology, not only through figures of Darwin and Linnaeus, but in thinking about their travels, their larger quests, and how histories of colonialism were so central to the project of science. And so part of the move of naming and organizing, I mean, this looms very large in science, the idea of producing order in the world. And Linnaeus was by no means the only one trying to do this, but there are lots of wonderful biographies that will explain why he became the figure that ultimately everyone went around, and why his idea of a binomial naming system is the system we still use. So if you think of humans as Homo sapiens, Homo is the genus and sapiens is the species. And so everything has a genus and species name, usually Latin, or it's Latinized if there are local names that are taken up. And so Londa Schiebinger, who's a historian of science, argues that the scientific revolution and the revolution in sexuality happened about the same time. And so sexuality became a really important frame through which Linnaeus named different organisms. And first, he created a hierarchy of organisms. So you have a species, a genus, a family, a order, a class, a phylum, a kingdom. And so everything was organized in that hierarchical order. And ultimately, every species got a name, which was this binomial name. And with plants, the ways in which he named them was not only sex. So it's called the Plantae Napterum. So it's not only sex, but it's the marriage of plants. So he imagined flower parts, especially flowering plants, as husbands and wives. So someone, would have 6 husbands and 2 wives, or 5 husbands and 2 wives. And it was actually quite scandalous for some people that, because it wasn't a monogamous imagination of marriage. And in fact, these were times when I think women were dissuaded away from the sciences because it was so scandalous and people called him lewd and pornographic. But ultimately, this is vocabulary we still use, even though now I would say, with respect to classification and organization, we have gone more molecular. So we look at DNA sequence in figuring out evolutionary relationship of organisms. But that vocabulary of Linnaeus still shapes how we name things today.
Thank you so much. And thank you for also kind of making that link with the history of sexuality. And I think we will talk more about this when we talk about the term plant sex. When you talk about classification and nomenclature, you also write in these early chapters about herbariums and pressed plants, and you also connect these things.
Yes. So one of, I think, the challenges that the colonists faced is that, first of all, you have different European colonial powers. They each have different colonies. So they're traveling from island to island, country to country. And so the question becomes, is this plant the same as that plant? So if we are interested in the pepper, where all do pepper? And so that really was the impetus in wanting a universal language. I think from the point of view of colonies that didn't expect to travel, universal languages don't mean anything. Universal languages matter to people who are able to travel the world and find plants across. And so creating that universal language, one is, creating the specimen became a way in which, way before drying a plant, and these protocols have shifted over time, but there's a protocol of which parts of the plant need to be there, and then you dry it and you attach it to a herbarium sheet. You write where it was collected, so you do all the so-called biodata of the plant. And I think even today, 60% of herbaria are in colonial powers, 70% of species are there. And with all plants, there is an original type. So again, it's really ironic that so many of the colonies might find a plant, but that original type is somewhere in the West, and getting access to them is not easy. And so those colonial histories still loom large in how we think of plant classification. And so that herbarium sheet is really, really important. Now, as we have moved away from the morphology of the plant as being the thing that determines how we classify something, because it's become more molecular, but still herbaria sheets are really important. And now we are facing this moment. So, for example, Duke University has a big herbarium, and now they are talking about closing it. And so the question becomes, what happens with all those sheets? Because it takes a lot of maintenance. But very rarely, just like in museums, is there talk about, let's return it to the countries we brought it from, right? That's still not a conversation that's happening yet. At best, some herbaria have digitized what they have, but it's not a very large percentage. So those colonial histories remain in access to very foundational material in biology.
In fact, you use the term botany as an imperial archive. So in a way, these all contribute to that archive.
Absolutely. Yes. And we are still holding on to both the archive and the imagination of the archive in contemporary botany. And so to me, sort of the dried, pressed flowers seems like a very apt metaphor for empire.
Exactly. And I also like the term that you use of herbariums as sort of a global mortuary.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, really powerful imagery. When you spoke about the language of Latin, because you said a lot of the names were either in Latin or they were Latinized. And here, I'd like to know a little bit more about what happened to traditional names and names in other languages.
So I think they were often forgotten. And certainly names that when I grew up and I knew, new plants around, when you go to school, you have to learn the Latin name. And this is why I sort of feel that a botanical education really alienates you from the world outside. And at least the way botany was taught to me, it was all, India was very rote. And so I would have a description of the plant, but that's not what matters in botany class. You have to be able to name the things that botanists consider important, which is the shape of the leaf, the kind of composition of the leaves, how the branching structure works. And so that's part of botanical education. In some cases, certainly local names made it into Latin. So I don't know, growing up, the sapota fruit, right? I knew it as sapota, and it is actually Sapotaceae. So there are places where it is the same. I never recognized Sapotaceae as the sapota that I ate. So here and there, local names do make it in there, but a lot of the names are about the colonists themselves. I mean, Linnaeus has things named after him, Darwin has things named after him, or celebrities. Now there's, I think, Lady Gaga has something named after her, Obama has something named after him. And often it was kings, queens, the various imperial hierarchy of viceroys. And so, like 2 years ago, when the movement in South Africa of Rhodes Must Fall, where they were taking down names of buildings named after Cecil Rhodes, taking down statues of Cecil Rhodes, it's like, why do we support this, this colonial, brutal figure? And someone pointed out there are 126 plant names that are still named after Rhodes. And so it brought up this question of how much of our names comes from those colonial histories. But it seems like very slow going. So there's beginning to be a move about maybe we need to change these plant names and name them about other things, maybe bring back some of these local names. But it seems slow going. There have been a couple cases that have been taken up, but not large scale names. But personally, to me, I sort of feel I am increasingly thinking that maybe we have many languages in the world. Why should plants have only one name? And so rather than waiting for the legacies of empire to change names of plants, maybe as citizens, we need to invoke names of plants as we know them, as we love them, as the ways in which they're entangled in our lives. And we will just have a polyvocal, vocabulary.
Sometimes we're nothing like our name. Like my name, Susan, is supposed to mean gentle white lily, and I'm nothing like that. So,
And it's true, especially in India, there are people who have nicknames in different parts of the family. And so to me, this is again part of thinking about this project. I've been so struck, like India right now with numerology, people just suddenly an A appears, an E appears, they change their names. Streets have changed their names. We have different kinds of nicknames where they'll say, what is your good name?
exactly. Especially with Bengalis.
Exactly. And so different parts of India have such different systems of, like my mother, for example, when she was young, had her mother's name as her last name. Her mother's first name as her last name versus the sons had the father's name. So there are, again, so many different naming traditions in India, some more matriarchal, some more patriarchal. And all that history gets erased when we now have to take on this British colonial way of thinking and naming. And so I've been thinking about the ways in which we might refuse that and bring back these varied traditions. Who says there has to be only one way to name? Yeah.
Excellent. Before we speak a little bit more about some of these histories, there are a couple of things I know that have really influenced your book. And here you refer to kind of disability and crypt studies and queer studies. And if you could speak a little bit more about how that influenced the writing of the book.
So I very broadly am part of this field called feminist science and technology studies. Some of, I would say, the cutting and part of feminist science and technology studies is really about asking, how did we get here? How did things get to be the way they are? It's about saying everything in the past is terrible, but it's about trying to understand how things come to be. And sometimes it is a particular colonial imagination or certain patriarchal imagination has produced something, and then we think about how might we do things differently. And so this question of time has been really important with both queer theory and with disability studies. So both queer studies and disability study ask this question of what is normal time? And so, for example, if you think of people who are not following the heterosexual path, the so-called normal path is you grow up and then you partner with someone who is the opposite sex, and then you get married, and then you have children. Certainly in India, at some point they'll say, aren't you married yet? You get pressure, your parents get pressure for why they're not doing the right thing as parents. So there's a sense of linear time of what you should be doing at different ages. And if you were not straight, this is a very different path of how one lives a life. Now in the US, you can get married as a gay person, but for a long time you couldn't. And so if you're not caught up in the having babies thing, which certainly it's not an ambition I ever had in my life. And so then it's a completely different sense of time and what you're supposed to do. And so what was really striking when I was reading how we talked about plants was this one is that they do such different things. A lot of plants are not sexual reproducers. And here again, it's like they are asexual. Again, it turns on the sexual as the main mode of. So lots of things asexually reproduce. So flowering plants have sexual reproduction. There are gymnosperms that also have. And so they do such different things. And part of what we have done with thinking about plant reproductive biology is we have tried to force them into a human mold, and when in fact they don't fit that mold. And so to me, queer studies and disability studies were very influential in getting me to think about the ways in which we're talking about plants as humans. The sense of, they don't move, so they have to produce various things because they don't move. And somehow the movement becomes a disability in which, because they're not as good as humans, because they can't do all the things that are human. But if you look at plants, they are wonderfully innovative in what they do. They don't need to move. They find ways in which bees and moths and sometimes even human help move their seeds around, help move their pollen around. They use the air and water for dispersal of their pollen and their seeds. So they have found lots of different ways, and that is not a disability model. It's an innovative model. It's a joyous model. It's a model of desire, but we don't have the vocabulary to think about it in those terms. So to me, queer studies and disability studies forced me to think about how we talk about plants and recognize that they are not lesser humans, but they are organisms which do things very differently. And just like disabled humans and queer humans do things very differently, and they are not lesser than the normal, we need to understand evolution, innovation, diversity, difference as different adaptations, that these are different modes of living. And that in part, it is that colonial patriarchal type of what the normal is that is holding us back. If we give that up, then the possibilities are endless.
I had one question when talking about history, because when you speak about Linnaeus, you also speak about the Hortus Malabarica. And here I have to say that I just loved this chapter. And I went into a bit of a rabbit hole after that, trying to read everything I could about K.S. Manilal and University of Calicut and, and other things. So if you could speak a little bit about the Hortus and what that signifies. And I think it's really important because I think it's a good juxtaposition, against Linnaeus and his systems.
So I am not a historian of science, so much of the history I draw from, what the literature is. I think it's in 2025, there's a wonderful anthology edited by Meenakshi Menon that will be coming out entirely about the Hortus. And I think the story is much more complex given politics on the ground today. So the Hortus Malabarica, so this was during Dutch colonial rule in the Malabar region. And there was Hendrik von Reed, who was the governor of that region at that point, and commissioned to develop a treatise of the plants of the Malabar region. And I was surprised of how it's still one of the few examples that people return to. And so in order to do this, he hired local. Some of them were healers, obviously artists of various kinds, local people who knew plants and named plants in various ways, knew what use different plants had. And some of this is, I think, the colonial powers were also recognizing that if they got sick, and sometimes they got sick by things they didn't know what it was, right? And that sometimes getting medicine from far away was hard, and recognizing that local people had a wealth of knowledge. And when they had various conditions, they used various medicinal plants around as a way to get better. And some of this was also an impetus to get, to collect that knowledge. And so he hired these local healers and artists to draw up plants. And if you go online, a lot of this is in digital comments, and they're beautiful, these various plants that were there. And what was interesting is, I think the 1990s, where Manilal translates that into English. So there wasn't an English version for a long time. And again, there's the kind of linguistic chronology. It was written in Malayalam, was translated into Dutch and then into Latin. I forget, there were many stages.
Yes, there's Portuguese, Dutch. There were a couple of different languages.
Exactly. Each of these translations, sometimes they are, especially the local words are exact. Sometimes they're transliterated, right? So there are many steps there to the final. So that was really interesting. Also, the different languages that were involved. And then this, seems to be the big hortus for a very long time of the Malabar region. And it's only in 1990s that Manilal translates that. And again, you're right, there are, politics around that. And the other thing that becomes important is that one of the figures who is actually named in it is the Itti Achutan Nair, who's a local of the Erava community. And so this whole question of caste has come up recently. And so the Erava community says the hortus belongs to us, because this is pre-Ayurvedic, all this stuff happening. This belongs to us. This is our knowledge. It needs, all the hortuses need to be brought back to us. And then this idea of medicinal plants, I think, is such an important story in the history of botany, because even today, so many of our pharmaceuticals we have because some colonists or some bioprospector goes and sees people who have been using this particular plant for a particular ailment. And then they take the plant and they'll find what the active ingredient is. And then that active ingredient becomes whatever drug we take. So much of the knowledge that was so-called Western science is really biopiracy of the ways in which we have stolen knowledge from indigenous peoples, across the world, and then gone through a process of identifying that individual ingredient rather than eating the plant. And so the idea of biopiracy is something that especially poorer countries have long suffered, because what happens is when someone patents a particular drug in the West, then you have to pay that money to be able to access it. And it seems enraging that local knowledge becomes a drug and then you have to pay for it. And so there were cases in turmeric, the neem plant, basmati rice, where people are trying to patent these. So in the 1980s, India created this traditional database library, looked to histories, they looked through mythologies, through medicinal texts of different traditions. India has so many different medical traditions. And then they chronicle, okay, this plant has prior use. So once something has prior use, then you cannot patent it because it's not new. It's not your knowledge. Since then, they've been really trying to create a knowledge-based system that is available to patent organizations across the world as a way for preserving local knowledge. And so in that sense, the Hortus Malabaricus in the 17th century and this traditional knowledge database system of today seemed like really interesting bookends, both in how much has not changed. So yes, countries that were colonized are now resisting and fighting back, but yet the whole system on which this is being adjudicated is still Western law, right? So we are still caught up in those global systems that were very much created by the West, and we are still at the mercy of fighting that, except there is more resistance to those systems now. the fact that as a biologist, I was never taught history is something that the book in some ways is quite emotional, both in terms of being angry and being joyous and being sad. But some of it is, how did we think? How do we think that we can produce knowledge about the world without history? That as biologists or as scientists, we are not taught to say, where does this word come from? What are its histories? Where do these theories come from? What is this terminology about? As though all these words, that words are just words, that they don't have histories. And so to me, the big lesson I've learned, in history of science is that how important interdisciplinary education is, how biologists need to understand some history, need to understand where theories come from, because sometimes that makes you a better scientist, because you're not seeing these as truths, you're seeing these for the legacies that they are.
We'll be back after a break. Banu, I just have to say that one thing that I really enjoyed in your book were the interludes. They were beautiful, because there was just this lovely kind of fiction and fable and storytelling in between these chapters, which I found really very useful because it helped me think about some of the political questions that I needed to ask after every chapter. So I really enjoyed those parts.
Thank you. Yeah, this has been one of the, I think this is why being in a field like women's and gender studies is great, because it's interdisciplinary field, so there is no prescribed way to write. And one of the first lessons I feel I learned in feminist studies is how you write matters. That writing is an epistemology. It is a way of knowing the world. And so, for example, in the sciences, when I was taught to write, often it's changed now that you can use active voice, but very much it was in the passive voice. And one of the stories a historian told me is that the time when the passive voice became, it's not like I took 50 mice, it's like 50 mice were procured, and then this was done to 50 mice, and yes, 48 of them died, and that this was really about saying, I didn't do anything, these mice died, things were done to them, that it was erasing the kind of violence and not making scientists accountable for their practices of violence. I found that really interesting. So again, how we write is shaped by these histories of what we are trying to avoid. Yeah.
I agree. I've written many UN reports and they're always in that voice.
yeah. 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 And so I would really love, that different fields learning to write in different ways, because you reveal different things when you write in different ways.
Banu, I'd like to move on to something that has already come up in our discussion, but I'd like to go into more detail because these are some wonderful chapters. And this is when you speak about the world of plant sex, as we term it, and how that is imbricated with botany's history of classification, something you've already mentioned, and also how it's connected with histories of race and sex, and how it perpetuates biological storytelling. If you could tell us a little bit more about this.
Sure. This is a story that most of us have learned if you're studying biology class. It's always a binary system. It's usually male and female, and it's a complementary system, right? Males and females have complementary characteristics. So one is active, one is passive, one is rational, one is emotional, and it's all built around that. And of course, whatever is ascribed as masculine always has more power, has more value. You get paid more if you have those characteristics. And what was interesting once I started reading about animals and especially plants, how much of those legacies still remain, how we talk about plants. And reading about the history of plants, so Londa Schiebinger is someone who I've mentioned before, talked about how the scientization botany and the sexualization plants, so that the scientific revolution and the revolution in sexuality and gender, they come together. So plant sexuality becomes a particular focus in botany. And reading that history of Linnaeus was that he really developed a backstory of the sex lives of flowers and where they became not only human, but specifically became husbands and wives. And so the whole vocabulary is about It's like, this is a male tree, this is a female tree. So if you think of something like papaya, they're on separate things. Or they may have male flowers and female flowers on the same. Or they may be bisexual, where over 85% of flowering plants have all reproductive parts, in a flower. And yet we will say, this is the male part, this is the female part. The anatomy of a flower, if you take it apart, all the terms that we learn, the filaments, the anther, the stigma, the style, these are all words were imagined with an exact equivalent in humans. So the filaments are the vas deferens, the anthers are the testes, the pollen is the seminal fluid, the stigma is the vulva, the style is the vagina. So there's a literal one-to-one correspondence in the different reproductive parts of a flower and the reproductive parts in humans. A part of what strikes you, okay, so you've imagined only male and female flowers or male and female parts. But if you look at what plants do, they do an incredibly diverse set of things. And so we've had to invent words in order to fit this model. So, for example, so if their plants are androecious if they only have male flowers, they're gynoecious if they only have female plants. They can be androdioecious, where they have male flowers in some plants and bisexual in another. They can be gynodioecious, where they have bisexual flowers and female flowers in separate plants. There are androgynomonoecious plants, andromonoecious plants, gynomonoecious plants, polygamodioecious plants, polygamomonoecious plants, subdioecious plants, subgynoecious plants, trioecious plants. I mean, I can go on and on, but it's because plants do their own thing. And so we've invented like all this vocabulary to accommodate this binary view of the world that we have imposed on plants. And that binary view comes from humans. And so in that sense, it was really fascinating to see how we've tried to imagine plants as Victorian gentlemen and ladies, when in fact, they do far more interesting things than that. And so again and again, reading the history of botany makes me think that we need other kinds of imaginations. We don't need to be stuck with this binary model, and starting somewhere else might be really liberating, not only for plants, but ultimately perhaps humans, because humans do far more interesting things than this binary model forces us.
I just love this. In fact, in this one of the chapters you write, trees and shrubs clothed in wedding gowns, flowers spread as nuptial beds for a verdant groom and his cherished bride. Are these the memoirs of an 18th century Academy of Science or tales from the boudoir?
Yeah, this is Londa Schibinger's quote. That's how she opens her book. It's a wonderful quote. Yeah, exactly. And it's really both, right? That's the point.
It's absolutely brilliant. And you also talk about orchids and how they embody some of the most fantastic, intricate, quirky aspects of plant sex. And even orchids have been forever saturated with racialized and oriental scripts.
Yeah, so I've done some work, thinking about artificial reproductive technologies as well in humans. So there's a basic heterosexual script in biology, which is about anisogamy, that you have two gametes. One is a big, one egg, and there's a small one that is the sperm. Or they may be big. Sometimes they're not called egg and sperm. But the idea is there are two different sized gametes. And the story is always whoever produces the big gamete will put lots of investments, will be nurturing, will take care of it, and versus the one that produces a small gamete, even though they produce a lot of the small gamete. And so it's still a lot of energy. But the story is that they don't really care about taking care of the offspring. They just go sow their oats everywhere, right? And this is a stereotype in humans as well, that the female is the nurturer, takes care of it, and the male is promiscuous because the biology of the male is promiscuous. And once you dig into the history of it, it's all on such shaky scientific ground, the experiments on which these were based. But these are stories we tell about the plant as well. And when you actually think about plant reproduction, where if you think of plant sexual reproduction, it's not as though the male and female are intimate with each other. It is always mediated by a bee or a wasp or a bird or, various other organisms that carry pollen from one, and when they go to the others, fertilize the other. Or sometimes it's the wind or various elemental forces. And so I sort of play a bit in that chapter, in that when we are thinking of intimacy, who is being intimate with whom? It's not the male and the female. It is really a multi-species intimacy with all these, insects and other organisms and the elemental forces. And here is where I think about Indian mythology of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, where all the elements are also gods, and play an active role in it. And when you think about what happens with plant sexuality, it's really an orchestration of so many different parts. And the things about orchids that are interesting is, so the story, at least the way biologists tell it, is that the plants want to attract this particular insect, beetle or moth or whatever it is. And so what it does, it looks just like the other one. So it tries to mimic the insect. And so some orchids look remarkably like particular insect. And so there's the whole vocabulary of, and this is this very orientalized vocabulary of, it's trying to lure this particular insect by looking just like its mate. And then it's actually really deceitful and, it's cheating it, because obviously that insect is not going to have sex. But whether that insect enjoys it or not, I don't know why it's assumed they don't. Maybe they do. As I was listening to these stories, I began thinking of, how do you know if the insect enjoys it or not? Why do we presume this is deceitful, it is cheating, and only the plant is getting something out of it? The insect is not getting anything out of it. Because in biology, everything comes down to having babies. So if you produce progeny, then it's a successful thing. But there's a wonderful biologist called Joan Ruff-Darden who challenges the idea that sexual selection is the only mode in which we should understand animal behavior, that maybe there is also social selection, right? So that we can bring about things like pleasure and desire. Maybe they're having fun. Maybe they're not bored anymore. Who knows? And so opening up animal behavior and plant behavior to other imaginations than that strict idea that all that matters and all that plants and animals are driven to is producing more progeny. And so these orchids, when you read them through these kind of orientalized stories, very much fits into sort of that deceitful female that is luring the insect there for nothing.
Thank you so much, Banu. And thank you for talking about these playful intimacies. And you use the term sociality. Looking at opposite of this, you also write about the history of colonial plant breeding as a history of violence. And so this is the domestication and control of plant biology.
Absolutely. And I think some of this, I feel, is coming back to bite us, in the sense that if you go to the grocery store, we eat, for the most part, just 4 grains. There's so much diversity in the world in terms of things that are edible, that we can eat. But we have picked those grains that were easy to domesticate, to breed, to produce, varieties that you can store easily, that you can transport easily, right? And so now we have a real globalized agriculture in terms of what is grown in different places, but it is such a fraction of what is edible. And now we are going back, like in India, all the Navadanya, we're going back to the old millets, which is what, grew. And similarly, in the US, if you go to the fancy stores, you can buy dandelion greens. And that is a weed that grows in everyone's yard that we are putting chemicals to kill, right? But at the same time, it's also, as we are recovering all these different things that grow all around us. But these have become these superfoods that are super expensive. And it all shows how unconnected we have become to the world around, how little we know about what is edible and not, how limited what we eat really is. And I feel so much of the new food movements are precisely about undoing this history of violence of plants, that we only eat so few things, and introducing us to a much larger repertoire of what we eat. And if you think about what we have done to plants through domestication, I mean, most of us, when we look at the original wild plant, it looks nothing like what we have done to it here. But here it's also interesting about those plants that refused. So even if you think, for example, of the dog and the cat, the variety of dog breeds is enormous. There are some that are as small as a rat and some that are as, big as a horse. Cats, not so much. And so here they talk about closed genetic systems and open genetic systems, that some species allow breeding in lots of different ways and others just refuse it. And so there are so many delicious fruits that don't have a global reach. We don't see in our supermarkets because they only last a week and they haven't figured out how to breed one that will stay in grocery stores for a long time. And so I think it's all those resistors. And now with all this talk of local food, that's what we should be doing. We should be looking at what grows around us. And so I feel all this history is being undone with climate change as we are looking at the real cost of the violence of domestication.
Thank you so much, Banu. And I think this leads us really well into my next question, which is, again, such a fascinating part of your book, which is about invasion biology. And if you could speak more about this, and you also talked about, local growing and local eating. So I'm also curious to see how these also connect.
Yeah, this whole work came up when I was doing a set of experiments with these two colleagues of mine, Jim Beaver and Peggy Schultz. So within biology, since the 1980s, this field of invasion biology has become really big. And to cut a long story short, in periods when there is great deal of xenophobia about human migrants, historians have noted how germ panics or fear of foreign species, plants and animals, and bacteria also happen. So when we face a period of xenophobia, we are xenophobic across species. And I feel that's what certainly in the US in the last 20, 30 years that I've been tracking this has been a period of really of anti-immigration, of a suspicion of foreigners, of wanting to close, borders. And so invasion biology has become where some biologists will say it is the number one environmental problem. And the solution is always we need to kill these invasive species, we need to kill foreign species, because you never know which foreign species will become invasive. And we need to create native gardens and native species. And, you go back to Nazi Germany. This is the language about native gardens that were going there. So there is a long history about how we think about what is native and what is foreign. As I was reading the history of colonial botany, you realize what a weird moment we're in now. Less than 100 years ago in the US Department of Agriculture sent scientists to go and find interesting plants across the world. So a scientist like David Fairchild, one person brought back more than 200,000 species into the US because there was no sense of that borders were bad, that it was bad to move things around. Think of all the plantations that colonists produced, the number of species they brought to the colonies and forced cultivation, all the stuff in Kew Gardens and gardens across the world where they showcased the wonderful plants that they found in colonized nations. And you go to Kew Gardens, it's all organized in, sort of the different places they had colonies. At least within the US, you see there's a particular moment. So there was this laissez-faire, you move plants around. And then there's a particular moment when the quarantine laws come, where they say, we will not allow Chinese immigration, we will not allow European immigration. And you begin to see this idea that borders are really important. We need to protect the native, we need to be against the foreign. And the quarantine laws for animals and plants is 1 year before human quarantine laws. So again, throughout the book, I use this term that Donna Haraway coined called nature cultures, where she argues that nature and culture are not separate. They are a binary imagination of colonial botany or colonial biology that wants to separate nature from culture and often human from the more than human worlds. Rather, if you think of nature culture, you begin to see what happens with humans, the history of humans tracks what happens with plants and animals very, very well, right? So for me, that point in which we start restricting borders. There was a study a few years ago where they were looking at so-called alien flora in the former colonies, and they find such a strong colonial imprint. The British colonies look very similar on what is there. The Spanish colonies look very similar on what was there. And so if we are talking about why we have a problem of foreign species, it is that colonial history that has produced it, not the new immigrants that are coming. A lot of species that become invasive species have been here for a long time. So then the question becomes, why are they were in small numbers before, why are they taking off now? And so to me, invasive species are a symptom of a larger problem with how we manage land, of how we develop and overdevelop, how we cut forests to do what we want, the amount of new mega developments that are being built with these huge houses for the wealthy. We think of climate change, if we think of our industrial policy. Those are the big questions. Versus here, what is done is every weekend they will mobilize people to go pull a particular invasive plant out. And very often, if you just plant the native species in, it will not necessarily do well because we've changed the soil. We've changed the environment. The climate is different. And so I find that this is really ultimately a vocabulary that perpetuates a fear of foreigners. The particular irony of the local food that you were talking about. So, for example, there is the Asian carp in the Great Lakes in the US, and it's considered quite the pest, and it's growing in huge numbers. And it turns out it's native of China. It's been overfished there. It's a delicacy there. People love to eat it. Overfished, it's not there. But no one knows how to eat it here, or people haven't developed a taste for it here. And it's a huge invasive species. And now apparently there's a company that pulls them out of here and then ships them back to China. But this says something about our ecological devastation, that we overfish in one place and then we hold on to ideas of what good food is, and we don't adapt as different things grow around us. We don't adapt to learning how to live with our changing worlds. And so that local food is also about trying to adapt to what grows around us, you know. But the fact that it's endangered one place and invasive and ubiquitous in the other says something about how we have managed the world around us, which has always been about short-term profit. I will fish as much as possible, you know, make profit today, and then there's not enough around us by the end of it.
It really struck me in your book when you talked about the tumbleweed, because it's such an archetype, like you said, of the American West. You see it in every film, the dusty tumbleweed just sort of moving along.
And that's also interesting why some foreign species become icons and people don't realize they're foreign, and other things are really reviled.
And in this particular case, I just love the fact that it's really a Russian plant. It's exactly what you said. Like with the Asian carp, people just didn't take to it. And yet the tumbleweed is in every Western film that you can imagine. And here, I love the term that you use. You talk about diaspores and diaspora. If you could tell us a little bit more.
Certainly, as someone who was born in India and lives in the US today, we think of human diasporas, of human cultures across the world, that we are connected, but we are not the same. And this, for me, is very much what happens with evolution, what happens with plants, right? Things are dispersed to different places. So diaspora and diaspora, they are vocabularies in both plant worlds and human worlds, right? That to me are vocabularies that fight that nativism. Everything is in one place. This is the way it should remember. We should always remain. We need to close our borders. To thinking more capaciously of diasporas as places of strength, as places of seeing the world, of finding new imaginations, of finding home in other places. That home, it does not have to be a biological home, right? Home can be the community you build in a new place that gives you that sense of belonging. And so to me, the language of diaspora really opens up. it challenges that blood and reproduction and that sexual vertical inheritance is the only model of biology, or the only model in which we can imagine human or plant sociality.
I love the example you gave of Tagore's vision for Shantiniketan and what you term as the cosmopolitan botany.
Yes. I mean, Tagore is also caught up in deep colonial stories, so I don't want to over romanticize it. But still, that imagination in Shantiniketan of getting cultures from across the world, he was not one of saying only Indian classical music. He brought Western music, he brought folk music from across the world. Each of the buildings celebrate interesting architecture from across the world. So this was an imagination about saying, there's so much beauty, there's so much wonder across the world. Why do we close ourselves away from it? But at the same time, Tagore was also very rooted to history, of recognizing that part of what colonialism does is makes us forget our own history. So it's not about a view that is refusing the past or refusing culture, but one that is inclusive of everything.
Thank you so much, Banu. Though we didn't speak about it in the beginning, when you start your book, you talk about the sublime. You end with it too. It'll be lovely if you could talk to us about what the sublime is. And if you could kind of wrap it up and maybe some parting thoughts for our guests. And if there's some particular messages that you feel we haven't really covered that you'd like to share, I'd love to give you this opportunity to do so.
Thank you. The sublime is something that when you read the history of botany comes up. And so especially around conservation biology, some of the key figures. So at one time, if you think about the so-called dark, very racist terminology of the dark continent, where these were places that were fearful, you didn't know what was there. And there's a wonderful essay by a historian of the environment called William Cronin. It's called The Trouble with Wilderness. And part of what he does, and it's in the book as well, tracks this idea of wilderness. And when you look at these early conservationists in the US, you will see narratives of they go up this mountain and that's where they find God. And so the whole idea of the sublime is one where usually there aren't other humans around. It is quietness and this idea that you transcend everyday life to something greater, to something closer to God. And I was really struck in thinking about my own upbringing, like in India, whoever you are, those mythological stories are everywhere. And in those mythological stories, it seems like there is never this kind of separation between human and non-human worlds, between gods and humans. And in fact, it's a very engaged, magical story. So to me, I did not feel the idea of the sublime in that kind of imagination. But the idea of the sublime in Western thought and Western biological thought is just so at the heart of the separation of humans and God, humans and other things, and of people who will say, we have to save the planet, we should kill humans, right? This idea that somehow humans are not part of nature, that humans are outside of it, which also means that we are somehow special species as opposed to everything else, and that we have been ordained with a certain kind of power that other species have not. Versus, I would argue, the imagination I grew up with was one that was very entangled with everything else. Humans were not separate from others. Gods were not always good. Gods were not always humans. Humans were not always good or bad, right? But these were qualities that were everywhere. And that created a very different kind of imagination than the Western imagination of the sublime, where you need to go to a pristine nature that was pure, that was without human, that was without civilization, away from the urban to really find nature and to transcend this world to another space. And so to me, I am very much writing against the sublime and that kind of imagination where humans are not part of nature, when in fact, I think what we need to do is to figure out how to live with nature so we don't exploit nature, that this is not an extractive living, that the world around us is not there for us to exploit. but rather the world around is there for us to live with. We have done, I feel, tremendous damage to the planet, and it seems to be just maybe accelerating at this moment. But with climate change and, for example, species are already moving, whether we like it or not. And so rather than this imagination of a restoration biology where we will restore world to something in the past where things were adapted to particular environments, if the environments change, things will change. And so rather than holding on to some nostalgic idea of Eden or something of the past that was native, I think we need to open our imaginations and move with what's happening around us, which means to find a way of give and take with the world around, of respecting what is around rather than exploiting the world.
Thank you so much, Banu. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you as a guest. And this is our last episode for this season. And I really could not think of a better way to finish this off. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks to Professor Banu Subramaniam for sharing her thoughts with us. The Subverse is the podcast of Dark and Light, a digital space that chronicles the times we live in and reimagines futures with a focus on science, nature, social justice, and culture. You can follow us on Instagram at Dark and Light Zine. If you like the show, please tell a friend and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. The Subverse is produced for us by Waka Media. This is our season finale, and we invite you to get in touch. Let us know what you think, share reviews, comment on our episodes on social media. Best wishes for the end of year. Till next time. So long, and thanks for listening.